Why does God require fear from humans? Hello, dear listeners. I am truly delighted to be with you today through this audiobook. Thank you for taking a moment to pause from your busy daily life and join me on this deep spiritual journey. I hope that this time of sharing together will go beyond mere knowledge transfer and resonate deeply within our souls. The question we will explore together is both simple and profound. Why does God require fear from humans? At first hearing, this question may seem strange. In modern society, the word fear is usually considered a negative emotion, something we want to avoid. Yet the Bible clearly states, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Why would a God of love require fear from us? Is this a true paradox of faith? Or are we misunderstanding the concept of fear? Through this audiobook, we will explore the depths of this question together, examining what true reverence for God means and how it impacts our faith and lives. We will illuminate this topic from various perspectives: historical, philosophical, psychological, sociological, and above all, biblical. Now, shall we begin our journey? Like exploring the deep sea, let us discover together what it means to fear God. Chapter 1. The true meaning of fear in the Bible. How do you think about the emotion of fear? Perhaps many of you think of the heart pounding when watching a horror movie, the dizziness felt when looking down from a high place, or the anxiety before an important presentation. Does the Bible's command to fear God mean this kind of emotion? Should we tremble and be terrified before God? Dr. David Baker, a Hebrew and Greek biblical scholar, says, "The words yirah and phobos, translated as fear in the biblical languages, contain complex emotions of awe, reverence, and wonder that go beyond simple terror. This is a natural response felt before overwhelming majesty and holiness." Let's think of a simple example. Imagine you had never seen the ocean before and stood before the vast sea for the first time. The endless horizon, waves constantly rolling in, the sea's ever-changing colors. What emotions would that scene evoke in you? Fear, wonder? Probably both. It's not terror, but awe. What you feel before something much greater and more powerful than yourself. But here we need to raise a critical question. In modern society, have we perhaps lost the ability to truly revere anything? In an age where everything is accessible with a click or a swipe, we may have lost our capacity for wonder. In a world where everything has become an object of consumption, awe is becoming an increasingly rare emotion. How does the Bible describe fearing God? The prophet Isaiah cried out before God's presence, "Woe is me, for I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips." This is a natural human response when standing before absolute holiness. Moses removed his shoes before the burning bush, and John in Revelation wrote that he fell as dead when he saw the risen Christ. Now, how can we apply such awe to our lives? First, we can examine our attitude in prayer. While it's good to feel comfortable when praying to God as we would with a friend, we must not forget that we are speaking to the Almighty, who created the universe. Second, we can consider our approach to worship. Modern worship sometimes becomes so casual that it fails to adequately reflect God's holiness and majesty. To fear God is ultimately to acknowledge the essential order of existence. It is a humble attitude that recognizes the fundamental difference between creator and creation, between the eternal and the finite. Without such awe, we risk placing God at our level or even below us. Chapter 2. Historical understanding of reverence. How has fear of God, or reverence, been understood throughout the flow of history? Now let's take a time journey to examine how fearing God has been understood across various eras and cultures. Religious historian Rudolf Otto introduced the concept of numinous in his famous work, The Idea of the Holy. He described the emotion humans feel before sacred beings as a fearful yet fascinating experience. For Otto, divine beings simultaneously evoke both fear and attraction. How can we understand this in daily life? Imagine a stormy day. When thunder and lightning streak across the sky, we feel fear but are simultaneously captivated by that majestic spectacle. We watch the storm safely through a window, appreciating both its beauty and danger. For ancient peoples, natural phenomena were often considered manifestations of divine beings, and such experiences likely became the archetype of religious awe. But here, a critical question arises. As modern science has advanced, and we've learned that lightning is simply an electrical phenomenon, does scientific understanding of natural phenomena necessarily reduce our awe of God? While it's true that religious reverence has decreased in Western society since the Enlightenment, this isn't necessarily due solely to scientific advancement. Medieval Christianity often emphasized God's judgment and wrath. In works like Michelangelo's Last Judgment, we can see Christ as judge. However, after the Reformation, especially in modern times, God's love and grace began to be more emphasized. While this change brought balance, it also weakened the emphasis on God's holiness and sovereignty. Through all these historical changes, the Bible consistently shows the balance between God's love and holiness, grace and justice. The psalmist sang, "As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us, for those who fear him." Practically, we can learn the balance of reverence from faith ancestors throughout history. Thinkers like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, and Jonathan Edwards all emphasized both God's sovereignty and love simultaneously. The Puritan devotional life particularly shows that deep reverence for God and intimacy can coexist. In my personal opinion, what modern people have lost is perhaps this balanced reverence. We often oscillate between extremes, treating God too familiarly or feeling him too distant. True reverence lies in the middle, an intimate yet awesome relationship. Chapter 3: The Psychological Dimension of Reverence. From a psychological perspective, what does it mean to fear God? What insights does modern psychology provide about religious experience and awe? In this chapter, we'll explore these psychological dimensions together. The renowned psychologist Abraham Maslow referred to peak experiences as the highest level of human experience. He described these as moments of intense happiness accompanied by feelings of wonder, awe, surprise, humility, and surrender. Though Maslow wasn't religious, his description of peak experiences remarkably resembles religious awe. In everyday terms, this might be like the feeling when gazing at a starry night sky, looking at the vast universe, feeling our smallness while simultaneously being overwhelmed by its beauty. In such moments, we often feel the mystery of existence and the wonder of the cosmos. However, we must ask critical questions. Hasn't modern psychology, especially since Freud, tended to reduce religious awe to mere psychological projection or sublimation of primitive fears? This reductionist approach risks missing the true essence and value of reverence. Psychologist William James wrote in his classic, The Varieties of Religious Experience, "The most important fact about the ultimate nature of the human soul and the fundamental reality of our existence is the feeling that we are all connected to something greater. Only through this connection do we find safety and salvation." The Bible deals with such psychological insights much more deeply. David expressed awe before God's omnipotence and omnipresence, while praising that this same God knows him intimately and personally. "Where can I go from your spirit? Your hand will guide me there." This shows that awe has a relational dimension beyond mere psychological phenomena. Practically, how can we cultivate such psychological awe in daily life? First, we can spend more time communing with nature, discovering the mystery of creation, even in a single flower or tree during walks. Second, we can have more time for meditation and silence. If our minds are always filled with stimulation and noise, we won't have room to feel awe. I'd like to share an experience from when I lost someone dear to me several years ago. In deep grief, I felt acutely the vulnerability and finitude of life. Yet simultaneously, even in all that pain, I felt God's presence, an experience that strangely mixed fear and comfort. It was experiencing both trembling before incomprehensible mystery and feeling the hand that holds me within that mystery. Perhaps this is what psychological awe is about. Ultimately, fearing God from a psychological perspective might be the ultimate balance point and expression of maturity in the human psyche. It's a journey of acknowledging our limitations while finding meaning and purpose that transcends those limitations. Chapter 4. The Social Impact of Reverence. How does fearing God impact society and community beyond the personal dimension? In this chapter, we'll examine the social aspects of reverence. Sociologist Emile Durkheim argued that religion is a key element in strengthening social cohesion. According to him, shared reverence for the sacred plays an important role in reinforcing social norms and values and forming community consciousness. Durkheim said, "The sacred is always socially constructed, and revering it is ultimately respect for society itself." In everyday terms, we can think of how religious festivals or rituals in traditional societies served to strengthen community bonds. In Korea, village festivals or Christian community revival meetings strengthened community consciousness. The shared awe experienced in such gatherings deepens social bonds. But here we need to raise critical questions. In modern society, is the weakening of religious awe related to weakened social cohesion? What do we collectively revere in secularized society? Consumerism? Technology? Celebrities? Can these substitutes truly form genuine community consciousness? Social philosopher Charles Taylor diagnosed the problem of modern people as flattening of meaning in a secular age. In a world where the transcendent dimension has disappeared, we find it difficult to discover deep meaning and purpose. How does the Bible portray a society that fears God? Deuteronomy emphasizes that fearing God is the foundation of a just and fair social order. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Then you will be blessed before the Lord your God. Here, fearing God includes social duties and responsibilities beyond mere personal piety. Practically, how can we restore the social dimension of reverence? First, we can form a God-fearing culture starting from home. Simple rituals, like pre-meal prayers and Bible reading, are important. Second, church communities must be reborn, not as mere religious consumer groups, but as communities that revere and serve God together. Third, as Christians, we must practice justice and mercy in the public sphere with hearts that fear God. To share my experience, several years ago when our church community began local service activities, what started as simple service gradually became our community's identity, and our hearts fearing God were expressed as love for neighbors. Surprisingly, this shared purpose also reduced conflicts within the church and enabled deeper fellowship. Ultimately, a society that fears God is not simply one that performs religious duties, but a community where the dignity of all humans is recognized and justice and mercy flow. What we may have lost is not simply religious forms, but this deep social vision. Chapter 5. The Philosophical Perspective of Reverence. What does reverence for God look like through the lens of philosophy? How has awe been understood in the deep exploration of human thought? In this chapter, we'll examine these philosophical dimensions. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard explored the paradox of faith through Abraham's story of offering Isaac in his work, Fear and Trembling. He saw true faith as including the dual movement of infinite resignation and return by the power of faith. For Kierkegaard, fearing God meant a leap of faith beyond the limits of reason. To understand this in daily life, it might be similar to what parents feel when facing their child's serious illness. The parent experiences infinite resignation in acknowledging that their child's life is beyond their control, while simultaneously holding on to hope and faith beyond all rational calculation. Such experience connects with deep dimensions of existence, not mere emotion. Critical questions arise here. Hasn't Western philosophy since the Enlightenment gradually marginalized the realms of awe and faith while absolutizing human reason? Even Kant tried to understand religion within the limits of moral duty alone. Can such philosophical approaches fully capture the essence of reverence? How does the Bible meet such philosophical insights? The book of Job contains deep meditations on the limits of human reason and God's transcendence. Before God appearing in the whirlwind, Job confesses, "I retract and repent in dust and ashes." This is a humble response before the limits of human knowledge and God's immeasurable wisdom. Practically, how can we cultivate such philosophical awe in daily life? The answer lies in proper attention, developing the habit of paying deeper attention to life's mysteries. Rather than simply trying to explain fundamental experiences like birth, death, love, and beauty, we should approach them with wonder. From my personal experience, I recall falling into deep philosophical doubt several years ago. I began questioning everything, and nothing seemed certain. Yet paradoxically, within that doubt I discovered deeper awe. Acknowledging the limits of human knowledge actually led to an open mind toward mystery, that is, reverence. Ultimately, from a philosophical perspective, fearing God is a journey of humbly acknowledging the limits of human reason while encountering the deep mystery of existence. It's not simple ignorance, but what Augustine called learned ignorance, the wise attitude of standing humbly before infinite mystery. Chapter 6. Modern Distortions. Love without fear and fear without love. In modern church and faith environments, we often witness two extreme distortions: fear without love and love without fear. In this chapter, we'll examine how these imbalances occurred and their effects. Theologian Michael Reeves writes in his book, Why We Don't Fear the God We Should Fear. Many Christians today oscillate between two distorted images of God. On one side is a stern judge lacking love, and on the other is a laid-back grandfather-like God, lacking authority and holiness. To think of this in everyday terms, it's similar to parent-child relationships. Overly strict parents only instill fear in children without gaining true respect and love. Conversely, overly permissive parents might gain temporary popularity, but ultimately fail to provide necessary boundaries and guidance. Healthy parent-child relationships balance love and authority, intimacy and respect. So let's raise critical questions. Aren't many churches today focusing only on the message that God is love while intentionally avoiding messages about God's holiness and judgment? Conversely, aren't some conservative churches enforcing faith through legalistic fear? Modern theologian David Wells points out that today we have lost the balance between God's transcendence and immanence. God is both far and near, both judge and lover. When we ignore or oversimplify these paradoxes, our faith becomes distorted. The Bible says, "There is no fear in love, and perfect love casts out fear." This means God's love removes slavish terror However, elsewhere in the same epistle, John emphasizes the importance of keeping God's commandments. God's love and holy obedience cannot be separated. How did Jesus show this balance? He called God Abba, Father, with intimacy, while also submitting, "Your will be done." Jesus taught disciples to approach God as an intimate Father, but also called him Holy Father. Hebrews says, "Let us serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire." The appearance of two images here, service that pleases God and consuming fire, is significant. God's love and holiness, intimacy and fear, cannot be separated. Practically, how can we restore this balance? First, we need balanced Bible study, not selectively reading only verses we like, but accepting the entire biblical message. Second, our prayer life should include confession and repentance alongside praise and thanksgiving. Third, church communities must proclaim God's love while also emphasizing the call to holy living. In my personal faith journey, I learned that finding this balance is an ongoing process. Sometimes I leaned toward fearing God's judgment and lost joy. Other times, I focused only on His grace and neglected the importance of godly living. But I gradually realized that true reverence comes from simultaneously viewing God's holiness and love. Ultimately, fear without love is mere slavish terror, and love without fear is sentimental distortion. The biblical approach lies in knowing and believing God's perfect love, while acknowledging that this love leads us to holy living. Chapter 7. Cultural Change. From Reverence to Intimacy. How has the modern culture we live in influenced our way of fearing God? What does the cultural shift from reverence to intimacy mean? In this chapter, we'll examine these cultural trends. Cultural critic Neil Postman pointed out in Amusing Ourselves to Death that modern society tends to transform everything into entertainment. He said, "Serious public discourse has been transformed into show business, and this analysis can apply to modern religious culture. In many contemporary churches, worship increasingly resembles entertainment, emphasizing emotional satisfaction over reverence. As an everyday example, consider the difference between traditional and modern weddings. Past weddings had the character of solemn vows and religious ceremonies, while today, many weddings have become events emphasizing personal taste and enjoyment. While such change isn't inherently bad, there's a risk that something important, the solemnity and sacredness of promises, might be weakened. Let's raise critical questions. Isn't the relationship with God in modern Christianity increasingly portrayed like a consumer relationship? Don't messages like, "God exists to make you happy," or "Jesus is your best friend," dilute elements of reverence? Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck already foresaw this trend in the early 20th century and warned, "Attempts to make God too familiar risk turning him into an idol." True intimacy comes only from appropriate distance and respect. Regardless of cultural currents, the Bible shows the balance between intimacy and reverence in relationship with God. The psalmist sings, "The Lord confides in those who fear him." Here, intimacy is based on reverence. Jesus says, "I am gentle and humble in heart," but elsewhere in the same gospel clearly shows his authority as judge. Practically, how can we restore balanced reverence in modern culture? First, we should value reverence and holiness in worship as much as comfort and relevance. Second, we should pay attention to the language we use in praise and prayer, examining whether our way of speaking to God is too light or casual. Third, Christian education should teach not only God's approachability, but also His holiness and sovereignty. From my personal experience, I once always sought emotional highs in worship. Then once I attended a worship service, where I felt no special emotions, and I realized that worship's essence isn't my emotional satisfaction, but giving God appropriate glory. That realization added new depth to my faith life. Ultimately, even amid cultural changes, we must constantly ask what appropriate attitude toward God means. Intimacy is a precious value, but it shouldn't replace reverence. Rather, true intimacy can only truly flourish on the foundation of reverence. Chapter 8: The Theological Foundation of Reverence. What is the theological meaning of fearing God? Where lies the theological foundation of reverence revealed throughout the Bible? In this chapter, we'll deeply explore these theological dimensions. Reformed theologian John Calvin wrote at the beginning of his masterpiece, Institutes of the Christian Religion, "Knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves are connected. According to Calvin, when we truly understand God's holiness and glory, we come to realize our own sinfulness and finitude. Such realization is the theological foundation of reverence." To explain this with an everyday example, it's like the feeling a beginning player has before a great musician. The beginner feels deep respect while listening to the master's performance, and simultaneously becomes acutely aware of their own limitations. When such recognition doesn't lead to despair, but rather kindles desire to become a better player, it becomes constructive reverence. Now let's raise critical questions. In modern theology, hasn't the balance between God's transcendence and immanence collapsed? On one hand, there's a tendency to make God too distant and abstract, making him irrelevant to actual life. On the other hand, there's a tendency to humanize God too much, diluting his divine essence. The great 20th century theologian Karl Barth emphasized that God is wholly other, while saying that this God reveals himself to us in Jesus Christ. Barth's theology well demonstrates the paradoxical balance between God's transcendence and intimacy. How does the Bible portray such theological reverence? In Isaiah, the prophet cries out before God's holiness, "Woe is me, for I am undone." But after that confession, an angel purifies his lips, and God sends him. This shows that reverence doesn't end in mere fear, but leads to purification and mission. Hebrews says, "Let us serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire." The appearance of two images, serving God pleasingly and consuming fire, together is significant. God's love and holiness, intimacy and fear cannot be separated. Practically, how can we cultivate theological reverence? First, we must balance meditation on all of God's attributes revealed throughout the Bible. We should deeply consider not only God's love and mercy, but also his justice and holiness. Second, in worship we should open our hearts to truth's revelation through the Word, not just seek emotional experiences. Third, we must humbly acknowledge that our understanding of God is always limited and partial. To share my theological journey, I once focused only on God's love and grace. Then, experiencing deep life pain, I began thinking more deeply about God's sovereignty and mystery. Through wrestling with questions, I learned that God doesn't always give immediate answers to all our questions, but is faithful even in silence and works in ways beyond our understanding. Such realization led to deeper reverence. Ultimately, from a theological perspective, fearing God means seriously accepting his revealed truth, while learning to humbly remain silent before his mystery. It's a paradoxical journey of holding on to the amazing fact that this God who transcends our understanding and control has revealed himself to us in Christ, while acknowledging that he is beyond our comprehension. Chapter 9: Practicing Reverence in Daily Life. So far, we've examined various aspects of fearing God. Now, the most important question remains: how can we concretely practice this reverence in our daily lives? Spiritual guide Eugene Peterson writes in Christ Plays in 10,000 Places, spirituality is not a series of special moments, but recognizing God's presence in ordinary daily life. Reverence, too, should be practiced throughout all of daily life, not just experienced inside church buildings. Thinking of this with an everyday example, it might be like our attitude toward delicious food. We can remember that food is God's gift, not only during pre-meal prayers, but also while preparing food, eating, and even washing dishes. Ordinary actions become expressions of reverence. So let's raise critical questions. In modern society's busy daily life and constant stimulation, is maintaining reverence really possible? In an environment where our attention is constantly scattered and time for deep thought is increasingly reduced, how can we continuously practice reverence before God? Spiritual writer Ruth Haley Barton emphasizes spirituality of silence and solitude, saying, "For our souls to open toward God, we must first dwell in quietness, away from noise and confusion." This applies to practicing reverence. Reverence grows in quietness and careful observation. How does the Bible speak about practicing reverence in daily life? Deuteronomy commands the Israelites to remember God's words when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. This means faith shouldn't be limited to specific times and places, but expressed throughout all of daily life. Practically, how can we cultivate reverence in daily life? First, we can develop conscious gratitude habits from the moment we wake up in the morning, being grateful for small things and recognizing them as God's gifts. Second, we can give meaning to ordinary actions. When we view even mundane tasks like cleaning or cooking as acts of serving God, they become expressions of reverence. Third, having pause moments during the day, taking time even amid busy daily life to be conscious of God's presence. To share my personal experience, several years ago, I started the habit of finding moments of wonder each day. The aroma of that day's first cup of coffee, morning sunlight seen through the window, sounds of birds and nature. I try to discover God's gifts in these ordinary moments. Amazingly, this small habit changed my perspective on the entire day. Daily life began to feel not like monotonous and meaningless repetition, but like a journey filled with sacred gifts. Ultimately, practicing reverence in daily life isn't about seeking special spiritual experiences, but developing the habit of recognizing God's presence and gifts in ordinary moments. It's living with the recognition that every moment is holy, every place is God's ground. Isn't such a life attitude the true practice of reverence? Chapter 10. The Transformative Power of Reverence. In this final chapter, let's examine how fearing God fundamentally transforms our lives. Its revolutionary power. British theologian C.S. Lewis wrote in The Four Loves, "Perfect love casts out fear, but perfect love itself includes a kind of fear." For Lewis, fearing God wasn't simply feeling terror, but was the completion of love and the starting point of transformation. As an everyday example, consider the experience of becoming a new parent. When first holding a baby, many parents feel deep love, along with even awe. They're overwhelmed by the fact that this small, fragile life depends completely on them. Such awe makes parents act more responsibly and brings changes that prioritize the child's needs over their own. Here, let's raise critical questions. Is reverence merely an emotional experience, or does it have the power to actually transform our lives and relationships? If we claim to fear God, but show no life change, is that true reverence? Psychologist and theologian David G. Benner writes in Care of Souls, "True spiritual transformation begins with awe. When we face God's holiness, we can no longer remain who we used to be." How does the Bible portray the transformative power of reverence? After witnessing God's holiness, Isaiah responded, "Here am I, send me." After witnessing Jesus' miracle, Peter confessed, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man," and his life was completely transformed. Reverence isn't mere emotion, but the starting point of conversion that changes life's direction. 1 John says, "We know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." All who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. Looking at God's holiness, that is, reverence, becomes the driving force that transforms us. Practically, how can reverence transform our lives? First, reverence realigns our priorities. When we deeply recognize God's greatness, our small desires and temporary concerns find their proper place. Second, reverence transforms our relationships. Reverence toward God naturally leads to respect for other people, especially humans created in God's image. Third, reverence gives us courage. Paradoxically, those who fear God need not fear other things. From my personal experience, passing through times of deep loss and questioning led me to discover deeper reverence for God. It wasn't an experience of getting answers to all questions, but rather learning to trust God beyond questions. Such reverence brought peace and courage to my life and led to deeper understanding of life's purpose. Ultimately, fearing God is a journey that transforms our entire being. It's not simply religious emotion or duty, but a fundamental experience that reshapes our identity, relationships, and purpose. True reverence ultimately transforms us more deeply into God's image and leads us to lives that reflect His holiness. Epilogue, concluding the journey of reverence. Dear listeners, our journey is now coming to an end. Having examined the meaning of fearing God from various angles, how can we summarize all this content? Fearing God is not simple terror or fear. It is the natural response of a creature before the Creator, the wonderful trembling before absolute holiness and love. It has been understood variously throughout history and psychologically corresponds to deep human needs. Socially, it has the power to form communities, and philosophically, it connects to the mystery of existence. In modern society, we often wander between extremes of fear without love, or love without fear. Cultural changes tend to weaken reverence and make everything familiar and consumable. However, biblical theology shows the paradoxical balance between God's transcendence and immanence, holiness and love. Practicing reverence in daily life isn't about special experiences, but about a life attitude that recognizes every moment as God's gift. Such reverence has the power to transform our priorities, relationships, and ultimately our identity. One thing I thought deeply about while preparing this audiobook was how paradoxical the experience of fearing God is. Reverence makes us humble while simultaneously granting dignity. It reminds us of our limitations while opening infinite possibilities. It makes us feel fear while providing ultimate safety. English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries." Perhaps the essence of reverence lies right here. Eyes that see holiness in ordinary things, the ability to experience transcendence in daily life, and the humble attitude of taking off shoes before it. Dear listeners, I sincerely hope this audiobook has been a small help in your spiritual journey. I hope it has helped you understand more deeply what it means to fear God and assisted you in practicing it in daily life. All wisdom begins with fearing the Lord, and that reverence begins with fear and is completed with love. The journey of standing with trembling hearts before God's holiness and majesty, then being moved by the amazing fact that this same God calls us his children. Isn't this the heart of faith? I pray that such reverence will grow anew in your lives each day, and that this reverence will lead you to deeper wisdom and love. Thank you.